In this chapter, we will be discussing strings yet again, but the difference is we are discussing them in the context of pop and rock music. Of course, there are plenty of examples of pop and rock music using strings. The style of string arrangement that is used, however, does vary wildly, depending on the style of pop or rock music that is being created. As we have seen, there are a number of different library or virtual instrument options available to us. Some of these libraries, such as the VSL library, can be very complex and detailed, and others, such as the Cine Samples Lite library, is a somewhat more basic library, but there is no doubt that you will be able to use even a relatively small library to create excellent string arrangements for pop and rock music. What is critical when looking at libraries is that you have the ability to control expression within that library, rather than simply control volume from the MIDI dynamics. To show this, we have selected two different libraries that fall into the affordable category. These two libraries, however, still give us all the expression features that we need to create an interesting and realistic arrangement. The reality these days is that many artists and producers, even in, for example, the techno or dance music fields, often look for string arrangements to add a certain organic element to their composition and mixes. Sometimes this may not be required, but often it is, and can enhance and improve a mix. In the context of our tutorial, the question is, how do we achieve this? So we can now use these libraries to create a string arrangement for our backing track. If we look at our Arrange window, we can see that we have a stereo backing track that is ready to play, and to save time we have added a selection of string instruments. So first of all, let's listen to the backing track. So this is a typical rock song without vocals. It lacks a certain harmonic depth though, and so let's look at the libraries we are using to add this depth. In this style of song, the music is already quite fat and wide, so we have to find something that enhances this. With strings, there are fundamentally two options that we can choose. We can choose to use spiccato or staccato to enhance the rhythmic element of a piece of music, or we can use a more legato style of playing to enhance the musical elements by playing longer notes. The main thing we have to look at is the relationship between the different frequencies. The music is already quite crowded in the low end and mid frequencies, and especially if we consider sample libraries or some virtual instruments, they tend to also be somewhat exaggerated in those frequencies. And so this can fill out the arrangement too much and make everything muddy. Our tip here is to thin the strings out somewhat in the mix. But now let's look at what we are going to work on, and even if you feel the temptation to simply improvise over the top, it's still a good idea to at least have a rough idea of the chord progression and harmonic arrangement that you are going to play over. Of course, you can simply go straight away like this. The arrangement is divided into sections, and obviously I have to arrange the strings in relation to the sections. So let's look at the first instrument I'm going to use, and that is the Cine Symphony Lite instrument. In this library, the instruments are laid out over one keyboard, as opposed to something like the VSL library, where each instrument is on its own keyboard. So if we play from left to right on the keyboard, we start with the basses, then we have the cellos, then the violas, then violin 2, and finally violin 1. If I hold a chord on this instrument, you can hear that I can control the expression of the instrument by using the modulation wheel, and this is something that I use intensively. If we look at the settings in the Cine Symphony Light instrument, we have three options here for controlling the expression of the instrument. The first one is the velocity map, and this allows us to switch between instruments using velocity. So by playing loud, we have the shorter notes. And by playing softly, we have sustained notes. This is an option I don't personally use. The next option we have is the key switch option, and we only have two key switches. The first is the A1 note, which will choose the long or legato instrument, and the B1 note will choose the short, more staccato version. In this mode, I can also use the modulation wheel to control the dynamics of the legato instrument. However, this does not control the dynamics of the staccato version. The staccato versions are controlled via key velocity. Of course, you can also control the staccato sample's volume via MIDI volume control. In my opinion, you only really need the two options of legato strings and staccato strings to create interesting arrangements. To try and use all the variety of orchestral instruments in the way that they were designed within a pop or rock arrangement would probably be overkill and somewhat time-consuming. The next library I have chosen is the Orchestral Essentials 1 library from Project Sam. The Orchestral Essentials 2 has some interesting features and can enhance or add to the Essentials 1 library, but the Essentials 1 library gives this basic orchestral instrumentation that we need. We can control expression from the modulation wheel, and straight away we can hear that this is quite a fat-sounding library. Because of this, they may not fit in every arrangement, and that is the reason why we have some options here. Just limiting ourselves to one library might be too limiting. You might create a template that you think will cover almost all of your needs, and then you discover that it doesn't actually work for all situations. So having a few options available to you is very important in helping you create arrangements quickly and efficiently. You can now hear if I simply play along to the backing track using the Cine Samples library, it's a very simple matter to come up with ideas, especially if we have a clear idea of the harmonic layout of the piece of music. Another reason why the Cine Samples library is one of our choices is that it's a slightly softer and thinner library, and this allows it to sit in a pop or rock arrangement somewhat better than a fatter library. Of course, we do have the option of thinning out a library, such as the Orchestral Essentials library, by simply activating an equalizer and cutting the frequencies that are too pronounced in that library. But to be honest, why bother when you can start with something like the Cine Samples library that already fits into the arrangement somewhat more easily? One thing worth mentioning here is that by thinner, we don't necessarily mean this in a negative way. It is simply finer and less dominating. So now let's record a few ideas. So here is our first idea, and we can listen in solo and then in context. Now let's have a look in the editor. So now we have the question of to quantize or not. And yet again, I can choose to simply quantize with a certain percentage of intensity. However, the problem here is that, as you can see, I play in advance of the division points. And this is partly due to the fact that string instruments tend to have a certain amount of latency within the sound. They do not start with an instant attack. So you have to anticipate the timing somewhat. If we were to quantize this strictly, then the timing would be somewhat late. In comparison, the VSL library is somewhat snappier. So once again, each individual library will require some experimenting and use for you to work out how to play it. One solution to this problem would be, especially if your playing is not quite up to scratch, to simply quantize and then to add a pre-delay to your instrument track. This would probably be in the region of 20 milliseconds or so. But once again, depending on the library and the music, you would have to experiment somewhat with that setting to get the right feel. Another thing to take into consideration is that each individual note within a chord may be out of time to the others somewhat. This is of course something that will happen in the real orchestra. Not all musicians will play exactly on time, down to the last percent. So this is also something to take into consideration when quantizing. You will lose some of the natural feel. If we listen to this section, there is one chord that jumps out at me as being too early. So we can go to that section, select the notes, and manually shift them somewhat back. So having run through it a couple of times, I'd say that I would play it in again for a production, but for now it's fine. The main rhythmic side to the string pattern is lacking somewhat in drive, so I need to find a way to add more drive to it. Now of course what we have is the strings all playing the same thing, and if you imagine an orchestra, it would be very unlikely that all the strings in the orchestra would play at the same time or play the same things. In this example, we could imagine that the cellos would play a straighter eighth note pattern, whilst the violins might play the more rhythmically varied main rhythmic pattern. So I can overdub the cello pattern and then we can listen. We can hear that there is a timing issue in the middle somewhere, and so the best solution might be to work on the string sections without the backing track, but to concentrate more on the click. So now let's listen simply with the click. After a few goes, we can hear that the timing is somewhat better. Having recorded a couple of sections, we can go into the editor, and to do so, I would first glue the separate patterns together, so that now we can see the violins and the cellos on the same page. Having done so, we get a clear view of what each instrument is doing. Of course, what we can do now is select the relevant section and use the intelligent quantize function to bring them somewhat closer together. Certainly in this style of music, there is no harm in quantizing somewhat, as long as you don't create a mechanical feel. There's no reason to imagine that you have to play everything in perfectly, without resorting to the tools available to you. Used carefully, quantizing can be a very useful musical tool. So now, having recorded this staccato section, we can perhaps add a legato section. At this point, we can use the key switches to change from staccato to legato. Before the section we are going to play into, we can simply draw in the key switch. One thing to remember if we do this is to add the relevant key switch at the beginning of the piece of music to select the staccato strings. Otherwise, if the play passes the legato key switch, the strings will be playing legato if we start the song from the beginning. So simply insert a key switch at the beginning to choose the staccato instrument. Now we can focus on what we are going to play in the legato section. So here is my idea. And now I'll record it. Now let's have a listen. If we look at the edge of the page, we can see that I recorded the modulation wheel to control the expression whilst I was recording the passage. If we listen to that section without the click, we can hear how the strings follow the dynamics of the backing track. To know if a section is good or not, one of the best things to do is to play that section without the instrument and then to bring it in. In this case, I think it certainly adds to the music rather than detracts from it. It's somewhat subtle, but this is what we want to achieve. There's no point making everything noticeable. Usually you want to support the music rather than dominate it. Less is more. This is partly why the notes we are playing are in a fairly limited range. That way, they remain subtle. Now we come to the next section, and that section is the same as the first section. But instead of copying, I'll simply play it in again, as ultimately this will add to the music and won't take any extra time. Playing that section in is somewhat tricky, as we are doing the eighth notes in the cello and the accented section on the violins at the same time. The easy solution would be to play them in separately, just like we did at the beginning. But for now, this will do fine. Now we get to the section after this, which is once again a more legato section. So I'll record into this section now. If we listen back, we can hear that there is an issue at the beginning of the section, and this is a relatively common problem if recording with key switches and using the modulation wheel. As I had to use my left hand for the key switches, I then came too late when using the modulation wheel for the expression. And we can see where the modulation wheel starts, and it is after the first notes I've played. The easiest solution here is to simply draw in some new controller data. One thing we should notice is that here we have a single melodic line in the strings. This is quite a good way of creating something interesting without it becoming repetitive. And also, it's important that it relates to a melody in the song, with, for example, vocals. A common trick would be to have an ascending line if at that point the vocals were performing a descending line, or vice versa. Yet again, if we listen to the section with the strings taken out, and then with them included, we can hear how much effect they have on the music at that point. Of course, if this was a serious project, we would go through and perform it somewhat better, and edit in detail if required. Another thing I would suggest is that you remove the low bass from the strings. Perhaps removing everything below 150 Hz would avoid any muddiness. Another thing to perhaps avoid is the temptation to copy this track and have another library play it. Again, this will just add to any muddiness in this situation. Perhaps in another example it would enhance the music, but it's important to be careful when layering too much in what is essentially a fairly full arrangement to start with. Other examples we show may combine these two libraries, but here it's best left simple.